Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I want to remind people the fundraiser's almost over. We have met our goal, Gott sei Dank, and a big, huge thank you to everyone who has donated. But of course, we're going to continue the fundraiser for maybe a couple more months and then sort of be done with it. So at any rate, oh, and that reminds me, I have to post something on my blog okay. Anyway, I'm very happy and excited today to have a repeat customer to the show. Welcome, Dr. Matthew Minard.
Great to connect from the other side of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, I'm a Nebraskan, but yeah, I'm
That's
part
where we're right
Pennsylvania.
now. We're connecting East and West today.
I have now officially lived in Pennsylvania longer than I have ever lived in Nebraska, but there's obviously something about where you were raised that stays with you forever. Because when people ask me where are you from, I always say, "Oh, I'm a Nebraskan. I'm from
Yeah, no,
Nebraska."
it's like
You
the
know?
blue, like that, the whole bluegrass kind of genre. Like there's a subgenre, like going back to the Tar Paper Shack in Appalachia.
Yeah,
Someone
yeah.
who's left and kind of meandered, but it's home. So
I think there's a philosophical moment in there, in some sense. I was taught as an undergraduate philosophy. Uh, Michael Healy was the guy's name. He's like he was into von Hildebrand, and he believed that there was a whole philosophy of home that needs developing
that's
in a Catholic way. Well, I thought was very interesting. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
yeah,
Dr. Minard, thank you. I think this is maybe your fifth appearance on the podcast, fourth or
yeah,
fifth or
fourth or
something
fifth,
like
yeah.
that. So yeah, you're becoming a regular, and rightly so. I always enjoy having you on the show. Dr. Minard is, in fact, professor of philosophy and moral theology at Saints Cyril and Methodius Byzantine Seminary, which is near Pittsburgh, I do believe, right?
Right. Yeah, it's in Pittsburgh,
How long
technically.
have you been there now?
It's the end of my eighth year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just telling CUA they had something in the record. I was asking for something about other students of the same dissertation director, and I said, You guys still have me as an adjunct down at Mount St. Mary's." I said, "I've been at BCS for 8 years. Just
Yeah.
better for your graduates. What are they doing?" So yeah, I've been
Well,
been lucky to be there for a long while.
very, very good. Very good. I'm glad you're there, Southwestern PA. At any rate, the proximate provocation for me inviting you on this show again was that I did see a YouTube video that you sent to me uh, of you doing an interview on the Eastern Catholic reception of the Second Vatican Council. Now, this blog of mine, as well as the podcast, is obviously very interested in the Second Vatican Council. I know that's not popular these days. Oh, it's a failed council.
Yeah,
It's
get beyond
passe.
it. No,
Yeah,
get beyond it.
yeah, you boomers are still stuck on Vatican II and all that kind of stuff. Sorry, it's a valid ecumenical council. I believe that it had profound theological insights. And despite what the rad trads say about its multiple ambiguities that created a Trojan horse in the city of God, that was the name, what is that, von
Yep.
Hildebrand's book?
Von Hildebrand, yeah.
Yeah, and who I respect and who I love, but I've actually never read that book, Trojan Horses.
Yeah,
I did.
I think I've flipped through my copy. I mean, I may have read a bit of it in my
I've
more like
got it.
yeah.
I've got it, but I thought I don't want my memory of von Hildebrand, who I love and adore, to be, in a sense, besmirched by. Although I think what he was talking about in the book was certain permutations of the council afterwards, more than
Yeah,
anything else.
he was involved, I think, also in some of the early liturgical, we'll call it like super conservatism because I don't think it has traditionalism attached to it really, but
That's
he
right.
was involved in that. So, and I don't know how much of it was liturgically focused or on the other bits. I stick it somewhat in the vein of Maritain. Well, it's a stronger than Maritain's Peasant of the Garonne because Maritain actually
Yeah.
reads the council and just says he's like these are documents in which a Thomist can rejoice, right? He laments what's
Yeah.
going on at the time.
Yeah. So, at any rate, lots of people have lots of opinions about lots of things when it comes to the Second Vatican
They
Council,
do. Many flat.
and for better or for worse. I am certainly not blind to the faults of the council. I myself have criticized certain conciliar naivetes and so on. We'll get to the Eastern reception of the council in a second, and I don't want to talk too much, but I just want to remind people in putting Vatican II in its historical context, in order to account for what I consider to be its overly optimistic, almost naive belief in modern Western style liberal democracy, and that we can dialogue with that. We need to remember that every single bishop at the Second Vatican Council was it was a survivor in some way of World War II. I mean, the fact is, the council started, what, 17 years after the end of the war. We're further beyond 9/11 than they were from World War II. And 9/11 still is haunting our memories in so many ways. And so I think in many ways, the council fathers looked around the world and said, we need to hitch our wagon in some way to a non-apocalyptic, more congenial form of the faith that can dialogue with this modern world. Otherwise, catastrophe awaits us. But that's neither here nor there.
Well, no, I want to
That's
add something. I want
no,
to add
no. You
something.
go right ahead. We
No,
can
because I
start
had a
there. Then let's
student.
start
I
there.
just start there. I mean, I don't know. We'll see where it goes. No, I had a student who surprised me because when I teach in Catholic social teaching at seminary, that's where I teach the Dignitatis Humanae. I teach that over there instead of in the Vatican II sequence. And one of my students, really bright, perceptive guy, he commented on the optimism that's in there. It's like there and in Gaudium et Spes. Sometimes, the world's getting close, the world's coming closer together, means of communication or drawing people together as though you're just going to go beyond kind of sectarian issues, right? But he made a point. He said, a lot of these European bishops, not only coming out of the war, right? Because the cynic could say they're all just they have PTSD, right? There's a certain cynic that would say that. But he said, you basically have got a bunch of countries that are all in the midst of being rebuilt west of the wall, right?
Yeah, yeah,
They're effectively in this mode of collaboration among nations that were warring with each other. That you've got new bonds that are developing internationally. Like there is a sense in which if you come out of Europe's fragmentation for hundreds of years prior, that it does seem starkly different. The amount of collaboration. I mean, we tend to forget that because like we could say stuff about politics now, but like scorning the fact that we've managed to keep Europe a somewhat unified bloc, even for all the problems of the EU,
yeah,
is not a minor affair. So it's not for nothing. You could look at that and have a certain hope, right?
yeah.
That's just a thought. He said that. He said I was just because he's going to be a military chaplain, and he was doing something in a leadership class that had some talking about the Reconstruction, and he said I just had that on my mind. Like they're in the midst of that the end of that Reconstruction period. I don't know, just a
No,
thought.
I think
Oh,
that's a brilliant insight. It's the era, the United Nations at that point is not very old. It's the era of a renewed collaboration among nations. And we have to remember, it wasn't just World War II. I mean, World War II followed within just 20 years of World War One, which
mhm.
was a catastrophic and stupid war that destroyed uh, a certain European cohesiveness, actually destroyed the old world in so many ways and created the modern world. It was just a century of genocidal catastrophes.
Yeah, and
And the
all the
Pope,
revolutions. Like think about all
oh
these
yeah.
questions of identity. I tend to think the Pan-Slavic movement, but there's all the other stuff on the continent. I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
long.
and you still have the Cold War going on, and I mean it helps to explain why the council didn't come out with guns ablazing against communism
Mhm.
and so on. Once again, trads condemn Vatican II because it didn't condemn communism strongly enough. As if everybody didn't know that the Catholic Church was opposed to
Anti-communist.
Soviet-style It was, but the Church had to worry about the status of Catholics in those Eastern Bloc nations.
Yeah.
Okay, in places like
Ostpolitics. Yeah, the Ostpolitik wasn't just cowardice. I'm sorry. You and I are both strong personalities. I'm not trying to jump on top of you. I'm just
Oh
saying I
no,
agree
go, go,
vehemently.
go, go.
I agree vehemently. That's all I'm saying. Ostpolitik wasn't just because Paul VI was just weak in his will later on. I don't know the details of it, but it's understandable. And we can also look backwards with a lot of clarity,
Yeah,
right? Like looking backwards through the prism of the 80s and 90s back, is a very different vantage point. People's just is people are too ready to weigh in on what they would have done in an era they weren't called to live in. But anyway, that's a mansion of being vexed.
yeah. But the net result was, I think,
Yes.
that all can agree that the Second Vatican Council was sort of naively optimistic
When it got
about,
into the political stuff, especially, I think is where we can say it, right?
yeah, exactly. There was, even in throwing around terms like aggiornamento, opening the windows to the world, there was this. sort of naive optimism in the power of dialogue, of, in a sense, solving so many problems. And I mean, dialogue's important, don't get me wrong, but
Yeah.
you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. We really are. I mean,
Yeah.
I may have had a period, when I was younger that I could have I could have veered in the trad direction, but I just never, thank goodness it never was my world. And so I've seen my mind's changed on the council. It sort of was just a background accepted thing as a kid, right? And then, then you get into your 20s and that's where, the risk of radicalization maybe could have happened for me. But especially being an Eastern, the East being an Easterner changed my mind. And I had to teach the council so many times that like,
Yeah.
grappling with it and figuring out how to approach it has been fruitful. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so
Okay.
that's
So
I think that's a good clearing of the point that we're when we're being positive, we're not being naive about what the '60s were like. But again, I tend to see those sorts of things we're talking about in those sections that touch most on contingent matters, right? Like that's what the second half of Gaudium et Spes, which is really
yeah,
like a social encyclical, right? Because it's got that kind of big gangliness to
it's
it.
like Pacem in Terrace.
That's it. No, it's a re-echo of Pachymenteris
Yeah.
in many ways, right? Yeah.
Well, in fact,
So
there were council fathers who said that they wanted Gaudium et Spes to be, in a sense, a commentary on Pacem in Terrace,
yeah,
an extension of it into the world. So anyway, let's get on then to the Eastern Rite reception of the Second Vatican Council, because I do have a lot of friends who are Eastern Rite Catholics, who say, look, our perspective on Vatican II is far more positive than the current retrospective from so many very conservative Catholics, and now look back and see nothing but decline and catastrophe. So you, go ahead and get us
expatiate.
started. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I think you'll feel, and you feel free to take it a couple different directions because you're going to feel liturgy, you're going to feel questions of ressourcement and pluralism, you're going to feel bits of ecclesiology. Like there are different places that there are implications here. So
Yes.
throughout. Yeah, it's like how to say, like in some ways, just to level set the experience of, and there are various unions that take place. The larger ones being from the time of Brecht in the very late 16th century onward, where you start getting significant enough groups of, be they Ukrainian or then later Romanian, the Melkite Catholics. They're later into the 18th century coming back into union with Rome for various reasons. So, for instance, in the case of a lot of the Slavs, I mean, sort of forgotten on the edges of the Russian world, and so our clergy and our practice was all so terrible that you're just sort of glad that you have an ecclesial institution that's going to pay heed to you. And some of those unions were envisioned in being bigger than they might have been, but the politics of the era then, at the last minute, created situations where I think that certain section of Poles then decided not to reunite, sections in Ukraine didn't. But being in this state of being a church of Orthodox origin, now in union with Rome, in nations which were Orthodox, created. I only say this because Cyril Korolevsky says it. It's kind of like a Stockholm syndrome that you start imitating. I mean, he doesn't have the term. He's writing in like the 20s or 30s when he's writing an essay on Uniatism. Um, but uh, it is. It describes it like a sort of Stockholm syndrome that you take on Western practices with regard to discipline, with regard to even liturgy. Great example, even though it's a United States phenomenon, but it's not unlike it. My church is the church I go to in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, is this gangly architectural beast because it has a Roman style baldacchino. And that's all they had. They had no iconostasis, nothing. Probably had stations, I wouldn't doubt, because they used to do that instead of pre-sanctified liturgies. Because basically the Roman Catholics in town just said, you're not Catholics. And so they basically just said, to hell with it. We're getting red albs. We're basically going to say St. John Chrysostom around a baldacchinoed altar. Well, they kept it when they got that iconostasis in the 90s, I think is when they put it in. They had nothing. They didn't have icon stands or anything. I was so blown away when they told me this. So you've got this, it's a kind of a Greek style. It's not Slavic style, but uh, very beautiful iconostasis actually, in front of this baldacchinoed altar. And probably like the moment that caught the schizophrenia the most was whenever they still had the predella stairs. And so you would look through the holy doors, and all you would see is the shins of your priest standing up. So they had to lower the altar. That was before I go in there. Um, but that's sort of an image that captures, what happens with regard to your formation. So there was not a great intellectual priestly formation, presbyteral formation in the early Unia in the Slav world. I'm not as
Yeah.
familiar with exactly the formation in the Melkite world. Situation was better there. Melkites were a little bit harder headed and kept some of their prerogatives. Rome, to its credit, tended to rule on behalf of the churches in union, but the local bishops could not, the Roman bishops couldn't stomach seeing themselves as peers with these, as would be called by both sides,
Why is
unions.
that?
I mean, I think it's effectively a kind of cramped ecclesiology that can't quite figure out what to do with something that's not Roman. Let's, I do think about this a lot. Think about what the Baroque church is like,
Yeah,
right? It is hunkered down in not being uh Protestant, right? Which is going to then
exactly.
be a certain form of uh, uh Italic and Andalusian, whatever you want to say, mostly Spanish
Okay,
uh
yeah, well, let's stop there for a
Catholicism.
second. I mean, what you get in Baroque Catholicism is a church that is under siege. I mean, it's not just the Protestant Reformation, it's the scientific revolution, it's the Enlightenment, it's the French Revolution.
Yeah, it's the
So
politics back.
in the political, economic, scientific, philosophic, and religious spheres, the Catholic Church is under siege from all sides. So yeah, Baroque
Yeah.
Catholicism had wonderful strengths to it, but it did have a very thick skin in order to be in this defensive mode all the
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
So,
sort of like it strengthens certain elements of Catholic identity, modern elements of piety, because things were lost liturgically because of, he can drive me nuts sometimes, but Louis Bouyer describes it well in liturgical piety, even though
mhm,
sometimes I feel like I take it with a grain of salt because his own whipping boys are in there too. But he still, you catches some of the spirit of it though, some of the
yeah.
sentimentalism that amps up during the period. So it creates like certain clear references for this is what it looks like and what it's like to pray as Catholics. And again, you're right. It's
Yeah.
it's completely understandable. And you can see that probably, it goes all the way to Vatican I, right? Because Vatican I,
Yeah.
even the stronger ultramontanism is precisely an identity issue against against basically all of these encroaching forces. You can turn for a kind of source of certainty to Rome. So that seems like the identity of being Catholic. And so you've
So
got these
the
weird and weird.
uniates, in come the uniates, and one of these things is not like the other, and
Yeah.
that's you're the odd man out.
Yeah, they're ignorant, they're bearded, but they're not as well trained, different liturgy, practices don't match up. I mean, don't that's a long time of not developing the same ecclesial mind for how to think through dogmas, right? The theological
Yeah.
worldview and ascetical worldview is different. And so think about it, even though it's not the world of Neo-Thomism, but still it's a very scholastic world that comes out of Trent, right?
Yeah. Oh,
It's
absolutely. Very,
and
very
so
scholastic. Yeah.
And so you've got these, they don't fit that world. And so basically, in their education, though, and let's be honest, the Russian Orthodox did versions of this too. That's why the Old Believers came into existence. That was a liturgical thing, but their continued issues in the Russian church because they had to send to the West too, to academies. But if you're a uniate priest, I'm using that term advisedly, it's a bit negative. But if you're a uniate priest, you're going to be then trained in curricula that have lots of bits of Western thought in them, or you're going to go to Rome and then come back. Um, and so it creates a structure where you lose your identity. Your liturgies change sometimes massively. I mean, you make up low mass. There used to be a low mass form in the Ruthenian church and the Ukrainian church, at least. Very strange version of
Wow.
Saint John Chrysostom. But you replace pre-sanctified with doing during Lent with Stations of the Cross. Um, you lose significant elements of your matins tradition and the chant tradition, and you don't work to organically connect back to the roots of your particular tradition in theology and asceticism.
Also, did you lose your married clergy?
Oh yeah, sorry, that's like one of those like used to it. In the old country, it was permitted. But here in the United States, that's why, for instance, ACROD exists, one of the well, and sections of the OCA, to be honest, of the Orthodox Church in America, are because of the decrees against married clergy.
Yeah.
Effectively, they were told here, either send your wives home or go home. I mean, only a only a celibate cleric could say send your wife home and your kids
Well,
home.
yeah, being a member of the Anglican Ordinariate now, I can attest to the fact that sometimes, not always, but sometimes the married clergy in the Ordinariate get some blowback from local bishops, local priests saying, well, why should you be allowed to get married and keep your wives and all that stuff, and we can't? So there's a sort of resentment built in there. It's
Yeah.
not in all cases, and I think it's beginning to subside just a bit.
But
Just
it
as a
exists. Let's be honest. Cardinal Sarah, in not too long
oh,
back history,
I
made a
know.
remark about this, basically treating the married clergy as a kind of concession. And that is not even what the Roman Church has ever said, right? It's never quite known how to peg it all together, but it's always made clear since the unions happened that this is something that organically developed in the traditions of the East, and that should be respected. Um, even someone like the sacramental theologian Emmanuel Duranzo, when he talks about this, and I think you could lilt this in an Eastern friendly way. I mean, he says it's very fitting that the priesthood is celibate because it's clearly not. It's clearly a matter of just of ecclesial right. It's just a super fitting thing, and it's clear the way that our bishops are chosen from the celibates and so forth. That clearly the fullness of the priesthood is tied up with celibacy. But that doesn't mean that the regular priest, the priest that's non-episcopal, should
Yeah.
be viewed as essentially ordered that way. The way that Sarah said it, that really left a bad taste in
Well,
my
that was
Eastern
bad.
ears.
That was bad. I
Yeah,
know a lot of Father Daniel Dozier.
Dozier. Hmm.
Yeah, he really reacted strongly against that as well, and rightly so. I love Cardinal Sarah, but he was
Yeah.
wrong there, in that
And,
regard.
and
Now,
one
go
more
ahead.
observation to get us there. I'm sorry, because I think you'll see it's not just my total rambling. So the way that datum from our churches is taken into account, even to this day, shows that I think some of the ecclesiological and theological insights of Vatican II have not even been really internalized. There's still a tendency, even among those who allow it, to think of it as a kind of just datum that's there, right? It's a thing we got to deal with. I'm saying that's even better
Yeah,
than Sra's point. But there's actually an honest question to be asked. So, what does this tell us about the theology of the priesthood? What was missing from the Western articulation of the priesthood? Not that it was wrong, but there's something about the reality of the body of Christ in certain conditions in the East, that manifests something about ministry in the church, right? And seeing
yeah,
that as a locus to be considered for its own right is most definitely something in the great era, quote unquote, great, of uniatism that wouldn't be taken seriously, right? That there's something actually positively here from the East to be heeded.
yeah. And I don't want to stray too far off the topic of Vatican II, which we're going to come back to. But the thing about celibacy to me is it's an important question that we need to take a hard look at. I'm not advocating for optional celibacy here. I'm not that revolutionary, but it says something, right? That it's mandatory. Okay, because in other words, if we lifted the mandatory element and made it optional, how many seminarians and then priests would get married? And I would argue that a majority of them would, which says something about celibacy should be a vocation that you don't simply accept grudgingly because the church asks it of you, although that's a noble sacrifice. If you really want to get married and the church asks you to be celibate and you say, okay, I'm willing to give up marriage for the sake of the priesthood, hats off to you. That's a powerful sacrifice. Nevertheless, I do believe that vocationally, celibacy should be something that you embrace precisely as your vocation. I am called to celibacy. And that those who are not called to celibacy, perhaps, should still be given the option of marriage. I just throw that out as something that maybe the East can teach the West.
Yeah, and I mean, the East can teach the West, when we say it's difficult, you shouldn't do it quickly, don't. Because that's like we have the benefit of trying to reinstitute it and see how difficult that is. Because it causes all sorts of there issues of how you handle like the discernment process itself, the finding of a wife, probably some of the potential scandals downstream. We just haven't had that yet here in
Clergy
America.
divorce,
Exactly. Like how do you
clergy
handle that?
kids. Although
Yeah.
my pastor in the ordinariate has 10 kids, and they are the life of the parish. We love them to
Yeah,
death.
no, I've known. I mean, the same thing. This can be really beautiful, actually. But then there's
Yeah,
also what's the role of the pani, the wife, because that's a
yeah.
that's a dynamic too.
Yeah.
But I do think like what you're saying is the idea of just because that's we do that. It's discerning. Are you know, discerning celibacy in the midst of your discernment for the priesthood? And again, I can't. I'm not making claims for the Western Church, right? This is not my, in a sense, I've not dealt with the. I don't like getting into those polemics. You know exactly what those polemics are like,
Oh
right?
yeah. Oh yeah.
There are details of history that just make me nervous because I feel like everyone plays with those details of history.
Yeah.
But I can say that there's something that's I think it's actually good for certain parochial settings. It does work for us at least. And I don't know. There's at least time to live side by side and listen to each other in a way that's not defensive. Where the Easterners don't feel like they're don't give in to the feeling of feeling second rate, and that the Westerners think there's something just to see here, right? That's where you
Yeah.
first start. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in that
So,
regard,
yeah.
go. No, I don't
No,
want to
I
interrupt
was
you.
thinking maybe you're going to get us to Vatican II or
Yeah.
what.
In
Yeah.
that regard, Vatican II. What was great about Vatican II for the Eastern churches then?
Yeah, and I bet you and Rodney Hauser could talk a long time on Lumen Gentium and the decree on the Eastern Church, Orientalum Ecclesiarum. Especially the latter document was a truly big deal because it was a text addressing the importance of the unique ecclesiality of the Eastern churches, right? I mean, you've got multiple traditions in the Eastern churches. Um, but recognizing the fact that the sui juris churches really aren't just branches of the one holy Catholic Roman Church, right?
Right.
But there's a patrimony through which tradition, the paradosis of tradition, has passed in the Eastern churches that should be embraced and recovered. So interestingly, like the downstream, it's a short document, 6, 7 pages, I forget when you
That's
print it
it.
off the
It's very
website.
short.
And yet it basically fired up an entire movement, fits and starts, sometimes overzealous for thinking we're closer to union with the Orthodox than maybe we are, but that really actually like went back to the sources for our I mean in our theology, since our churches are small, so we don't have as many theologians. But you can think of someone like Coletta Anatolios
Oh
as an
yeah.
example, Summerson, um, people who are associated generally with the Sheptyski Institute, others at the Orientalium. That's a mixture of Latins and Easterners. Of course, if you wanted to get barbed, Taft. I don't know, did you ever meet Father Taft?
No, never.
Oh, he was a tough. For all I hear, liturgist. I mean, he was an Eastern Jesuit. He was a tough guy. He could be heavy-handed because he was a very his demands were high. He was a Jesuit with high academic demands. But you had intellectual ressourcement, but also liturgical. Basically, cleaning our liturgies of Latin accretions that got into them, and so for instance, the Melkites have probably the most active press for all these books. So even though I'm in the Slavic tradition, I buy from them. They're more Greek in their immediate kind of, they've got little differences in their typicon. But we've got these just scads of Manaean books, which are our monthly cycle for all the feasts. And our Triodian, which is our the all the books for Lent, and then all of the Pentecostarian books, and I mean all of this for like the rich details of our liturgy of the hours is mostly living in there, as well as some of the bits for divine liturgy have been recovered. And in parochial settings, better ones, these elements are included. You have the American phenomenon where like parishes, in my parish suffers with this, truth be told, where you have cultural Catholicism, and it feels like a Greek version of what we probably both would complain about in the experience of sort of the beige Catholic world.
Yeah.
Um, but churches that have like even a decent formation will do more of either matins or vespers, and these texts have been, recovered. I mean, they were extant obviously before, but there's been a much deeper appropriation of that and a real sense that like you do something different when you try to form your clerics. We're trying to at BCS without any real models to figure out what it looks like to form clerics. It's just hard because in one sense you're part of the universal church and you sort of have to talk the lingua franca of the universal church, which is an idiom that has scholasticism in it and just developments that are not orthodox because the church didn't stop at the schism. And neither can we think in those terms, right? But
Yeah.
yet has a deeper rooting in the early church, has a deeper rooting, hopefully patristically. So our guys do with Father Christian Capus, they do a lot of primary source reading in their dogmatics courses of just up through the weaknesses. We don't do much up past the seventh council. We do, but it's crammed because there's this sense that our vocation is to try to not just be abridged, because that makes us seem like we're going to be gotten rid of, but that we're deeply engaged with the early church tradition to be a point of contact for the Orthodox. And so grabbing hold of that, I mean, imagine that in the world of, the world that I've done all the writing on, the translating. I mean, the 40s
Yeah.
and 50s were not a world in which, as soon as you stepped out of the bounds too much of ecumenism, that you're going to be, looked at as being a safe figure. Whereas
Very
we're
interesting.
to basically live ecumenism. I never thought I'd be at an institute where part of our main thing is ecumenism. Young Matthew would have thought, oh, it's a bunch of Susans from parish council crap, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of religious relativism. What does it matter what denomination you're in?
What spoke on the great tire, I know.
Yeah. 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 That, trust me, all during my young formative years, one of the biggest problems that I had with the Vatican II church was, and I had read the Vatican II documents on Protestants and, ecumenical relations and interreligious dialogue with Jews and Muslims. And I'd read all that stuff and I thought, okay, that's not bad. But then, the post-Vatican II aura, the ethos was, Susan from the parish council standing up and saying, well, I'm married to a Hindu. Why can't he go to communion?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, for the love of, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff that just like then a trad will grab onto and just say, I mean,
Yeah, but fortunately, that's not,
no,
you know,
not the
we're
case. No, it's not the case. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. I'm
right.
like, groaning. Um,
We
but
don't have to be
alongside
stuck in that.
But alongside the other just kind of particulars, I mean, probably the deepest structural thing is at least beginning the work of seeing the way that, I mean, collegiality really matters. Our code of canon law even kind of opens with that across the face because we have the canons for the patriarchs and for the major metropolitan bishops, right? That they have certain prerogatives for the appointing of their bishops and their own self-governance that give, I don't call them firewalls, but they kind of are. They basically give firewalls that fix the notion of immediate jurisdiction that comes down out of Vatican I. Talk about a good example of like, if you want to say
Yeah.
that there's material continuity, I tend to say that. I just say that you have to somehow think it's super implicit because that immediate jurisdiction that the Pope has is only in view of the common good of the church and not the poking into his branch managers. But we have to be honest. If we're honest,
Yeah.
it was tended to be lived out in that first way. Whereas Vatican II, by beefing up collegiality, and the necessary role of the bishop, like it's the church's constitution really is like, and not that people didn't say this beforehand, but boy, you needed to emphasize it that the bishop's role is so necessary that it's not as though well they're not, it's nice that they're there, but the Pope's got it all in himself, formally, eminently, and the bishops help out. And that's very important for our identity because if you have a head of a church that has real authority as patriarch, it changes your ecclesiology. I mean, it's a very different ecclesiology. Our metropolitans function with their synod in a way that I think would be better for the West to start to slowly work in that direction.
Well, if that's what synodality means, sign me up. I'm all
Yeah.
for it.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than this, what, in 2028, we're going to have an ecclesial assembly. What the heck is an ecclesial assembly? It's no
Uh,
longer a synod of bishops. It's an ecclesial assembly, and there'll be lay people and religious men and sisters and priests that aren't bishops, and they're all going to do what
it sounds.
exactly?
I think you were probably a sufficiently sarcastic whippersnapper that whenever you had an assembly in high school, you didn't like it.
That's
Doesn't it
right.
just?
The very word assembly. Exactly right. The very
Yeah.
word assembly. It takes me back to what we used to call junior high, the junior high and high school years. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, but this issue though of ecclesiality is so important right now. Synodality aside, and all the crazy debates surrounding that, and most people know my rather negative views on the whole affair. The fact is, it would seem to me that the teaching of Vatican II on the role of the bishop, is really central to this issue of the right of Eastern Rite bishops to go there. I mean, let's face it. You mentioned Vatican I. Heck, right up through Pius XII, you still had Pius XII teaching that the three munera, the three functions of a bishop, to govern, to sanctify, and to teach, all come to him directly from the Pope, by way of delegation of papal authority, rather than in any way, shape, or form coming directly from God by divine right via their consecration as a bishop. Vatican II it doesn't tweak that doctrine, it reverses it. It does. It just
Yeah, this
reverses it.
I know
No,
this is because I've done this stuff on Journée. That's like the strongest stuff in him is when he's most like theological. But boy, yeah, this he tends because he's being a faithful guy back in the 40s and 50s.
that's right.
Is that
And that's
line?
what you had to do.
And
Okay, so that brings me to this book that I've brought up numerous times on this podcast, and which you also have read. It's called The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II, uh, Continuity and Reversal in Catholic Doctrine by Monsignor Thomas Guarino. I do believe he's retired now. He was at Seton Hall for many years. So to repeat that title, The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II by Monsignor Thomas Guarino, Guarino. And he makes it very, very clear there that this is a reversal. Collegiality involves, I mean, but then Guarino says Vatican II, though, is kind of clever here, where he says the word he uses is the council in this instance and in a couple of others the council masks it. It masks the fact, which is a polite way of saying it tries to hide the fact that it is in fact reversing a teaching. I mean, one we have to remember Vatican, and I'll let you talk here. Vatican II was in some ways the product, as all councils are, of a consensus of different points of view and committee. And so the theological commission, and Guarino brings this out, had sort of Ottaviani traditionalists on it. It had Ray Sourcemont guys on it, Monsignor Philip, and it had Congar and Bouillet, and these so it had all kinds of different voices. And so there's this tug of war going on essentially at Vatican II between the three factions, the traditionalists, the Ressourcemont guys, and then the liberal wing of Ressourcemont and the Concilium
yep,
progressive guys. And so Paul VI had a headache on his hands. Like in Lumen Gentium, they had this great debate about the collegiality
yep.
and the three munera of the bishop. And so the traditionalists are standing up and saying, well, then what's to hold the church together? What's going to bind us all, to Rome and so forth? And it became, they eventually go ahead and pass the change, reverse the old teaching. But it was so contentious that Paul VI added at the end of Lumen Gentium, the famous Nota Previa, where
Mhm.
he says, look, all controversy aside, the Pope is still in charge of everything, so don't worry about it.
Yeah,
So there you go.
yeah.
Anyway, that's
Well,
my ramble. So you can ramble now.
yeah, yeah. And so Guarino is, of course, I think a little bit in his theory of development. Um, he feels more he's comfortable with the plasticity that maybe is not the same as mine because he's got what's his, my guy underneath the surface. My goodness, now what Boyard is
Oh yeah,
underneath. And
yeah,
there's, as you know, there's sharks in that water because of my work with the scholastics. But still, this is exactly the dynamic nonetheless. This kind of reversal happens, in part because you're basically trying to nuance what's coming out of, I mean, the conservative position of the 60s is different than what 1870 was, right? But it's sort of this line. But the mind of the church, we'll say the Orthodox, lowercase o, Orthodox mind of the church is such that it has these three parties. Right. Some of the more concilium wing is drifting to the edge of not being part of that Orthodox mind, and yet, right, they're coming out as still the same, for lack of better terms, because it's a big catch-all, resourceful attempt to realize that the church's mind is not just this thing of the last 100 years or so, or 150 years, kind of a certain kind of scholastic
yeah.
approach. And so you have to put that mind of the church in the declaration, the mind of the Orthodox Church, right? So yes, is it simpler whenever you're just specifically doing canons that are very clear? Sure, absolutely. But the tug of war is actually part of like how you have to receive the document because it's precisely saying it's not just ambiguity for the sake of this party and that party, right? It's trying to articulate that you can't be Catholic without holding these things together, but trying to figure out, how to say where implicitness ends and where it was just a case of non-definitive teaching. And it's probably actually interlaced, to be honest, right? Like
Yeah.
the immediate jurisdiction, you can come up with a case where the Melkite patriarch is refusing to do something that's affecting the universal church. And after the Pope appealing to him through multiple channels, he doesn't do something that technically the Pope would have to intervene. Like you could get that case, right?
Oh yeah, and I don't think
But
Guarino would disagree. Yeah,
no, I don't. But what I do think is that I don't think most people who read Dei Filius, or not, sorry, that's what I'm always doing, Pastor Eternus, in its context, they would not be comfortable saying like all those qualifications that it has to be very
yeah,
specific, right? And that makes you think then that whenever you have the declaration of a kind of collegiality, there is something that's pretty significant in that meat. There's a big marbled piece of that meat that really is changing in its articulation. And I often think it's like I think we confuse sometimes. Like we tend to take as a block. This is one definitive teaching to be held with divine and Catholic faith or ecclesiastical faith, as they used to say, or whatever level one, level two infallibility. And in fact, what it is actually there are several things involved here with a couple dogmas that are really high level that like the Pope does have that jurisdiction. And yet all the baggage of how to think about that is basically something that's non-definitive and has to basically be reversed. Does that make sense?
oh
Like,
yeah, yeah, it
yeah.
does, it
Um,
does.
because like I tend to want to have more continuity. I mean, in the sense that I want to be able to figure out like there are these bits I have to keep because I don't want to have a deposit that changes. Right. We
Well,
don't
as
want
to yeah,
to,
it's
that's
right.
related to synodality stuff, right? We don't want to be reading in the spirit of the time something that now changes it. And yet we should recognize the fact that in that one cluster of what we take as being kind of the dogmatic point of Pastor Eternus, it's actually a real thin layer that's in there. And there's a lot of stuff that we attribute to that layer that actually is non-definitive.
That's very, very important point, I think, Matthew. Even Guarino, I mean, we have to emphasize Guarino is a very orthodox guy. And throughout the book, one of the reasons why he wrote the book was to show, I think anyway, to show that even in the midst of these little minor reversals, like you get with the three munera of the bishop, but maybe slightly a little bit on religious freedom, you get
Yeah.
some of these reversals. Guarino is at pains to point out this is in the service of a deeper continuity. This is not this is not God's doing a new thing, immanentism and relativism.
Yeah.
It is, in fact, an appeal to some element of the tradition. And that maybe adjustments have to be made in order to set the tradition aright after certain things got overemphasized or something. So continuity is, and so what I'm trying to
That
say is Guarino, when he says Vatican II masks things, it's doing so out of a genuine pastoral concern that continuity is emphasized.
Yeah, that it basically creates the hermeneutic for reception that sees that you ultimately need to basically see what is that through line of the deeper continuity, right? Like whenever you stop to think about how the approach to you shouldn't go baptizing people without their parents' permission, no matter what some Scotists and a few Thomists, but luckily not most of them. It was actually that for whatever reason, the Franciscan line said you could do the baptisms of the Jewish infants. From what I understand, that's what Journet says.
Or
But like
kidnap them.
I know it's I know you can't have Mortara not in the back of your mind, right?
Yeah.
But like the through line of the fact that for a long time though, the natural rights of the parents are recognized there, as well as, I mean, a tradition of, it usually was under the form of if someone was in the wilderness and they
Yeah.
God wants to save all, and if they work with grace, somehow they'll have enough implicit faith to be able to believe, right? I mean, there's in a sense nothing anonymous Christianity, the only thing in there that's new is the fact that it's claiming like something that's way too positive, that it's just present, the positive inclination is just sort of there in our nature. But there's an entire long tradition of basically dealing with these issues of implicit faith in the age that we're in with Christ. That if you can dip back into that, you can start to say, there's a real renewal of how to think through living together in a pluralistic society that we have to articulate the truth that societally adheres to get us in touch with that truth about the individual. Does that make sense? Think of religious liberty. Like
Oh,
I'm trying to
no, yeah.
dip into the religious liberty bit.
Yeah. Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
and you are tapping into something that's very like it's a deep taproot that like once you get in there, um, you could have people who are relatively conservative, no, relatively conservative, like Journet, or someone who's super conservative like Fenton even, although he's going to hem it in more, that all recognize, the role of that's there are many means of implicit faith, but that kind of implicit faith. But then when you talk about the question of religious liberty, it's going to be much harder. I mean, Fenton, right, is trying to get Maritain condemned for precisely these sorts of things. and they don't see that 19th century experience against liberalism, which if anyone listens to your podcast and thinks that you're pro-liberalism, they need to just stop listening because they know where you stand. The
Yeah,
experience of liberalism, though, led to some of those classic texts about religious liberty that, guess what, were probably in their form, in their specifics, they needed reversed, right?
yeah,
But it's like the branch was still there, right? You still to talk
yeah,
about an integral humanism a la Maritain is still to talk about an integration of a non-sacral Christendom. It's still a
yeah.
kind of Christendom, but it's a non-sacral influence
Oh, no
of
doubt. I mean, what
so
we're talking about, I mean, there's no such thing as a state that isn't integralist. They
yeah,
all
one way or the
embrace
other.
one way or the other. So we're just talking about different kinds of integralism,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
and so yeah, so you get Pope Gregory's, coming out and saying, and Guarino mentions this, the concept of religious liberty is, absurd. He calls it an absurdity on
Yeah.
its face. It's like, okay, that was what you're talking about. The construction of the idea here is deficient. But then remember, Gregory's reacting in the freaking, sorry,
No,
19th
exactly.
century, 19th century, he's reacting to the French Revolution, for crying out loud.
Yeah, and religious liberty seen as a true um just indifference to
Oh
the
yeah,
right.
liberté, more than indifference, almost an outright hostility
Yeah.
to things, an anti-clerical hostility. It implies a radical, aggressive secularization of everything. And this is the context in which, popes are swimming. All right. And so yeah, they're going to say, well, if that's what religious freedom is, if that's
I
what
don't
it
want any
is,
of it. Exactly. If it
it's
is, I don't want
absurd.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, we can't have that. But then later on, even Ratzinger then comes out and says, well, the fact is, truth is related to freedom. Freedom is oriented to truth. And you can go back into the tradition and find scads of church fathers and so on saying, no, the faith can't be coerced.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's really the a deep taproot of all this too. It's
Yeah.
exactly that. Is exactly that. You've read, I'm sure you have, because it's coming out of the John Paul II Institute, that volume by Healy, isn't it by Healy and
Schindler.
Schindler's, yeah, where they have the schemas of on religious liberty.
Oh my God,
They
it's a great, big, huge, thick book. And boy, is
yeah,
that valuable.
yeah, that's a very valuable book. I forget the name of it. Something human dignity or something. I thought it was right here, but
Yeah, well, I've got it floating around back here
um,
somewhere too. And its great value is that it gives us all the various
schemas.
schemata is, yeah,
Yeah, schemata. We should
schemas.
say. Yeah,
What's the plural of schema?
schemata. Yeah, but we're
Schemata. Yeah.
Americans,
Yeah.
so
The schemas. All right. Yeah. And it's fascinating because once again, you get a sort of insight into how the council's deliberations went on. Those who say, in other words, that, okay, the progressives controlled the council and deliberately put little time bombs of ambiguity in this. No, that is not how it happened.
yeah, no, when you look at those, I was doing it for this class I got to teach this summer. I'm trying to do some of this stuff that's relevant to the East. I'm going to try and crank out some translations for my students to read. And my gosh, I mean, how to put it, it's kind of like, there's a point, I'll get back here. So when people, talk about September 11th as though it was an inside job, it's like no one talks to each other in the government, right? Like you can't get that level of coordination here as well. I mean,
Or that we never landed on the moon.
yeah, it's like no one's keeping that secret. That would have been out so
200,000 NASA employees in the 60s
yeah,
and
not
70s.
one.
They all kept the secret.
That level of coordination. So you'd have to have an immense coordination. And you see like that it's it's the genuine mind of the church, it's the bishops, and acting, yes, with their parity as instruments, but also the bishops enunciating like incredibly important points. Like, I mean, sometimes it's tedious at times. I'm trying to think
Yeah.
which section of tedium do I need to get? But it's because they're taking it seriously.
Yeah.
This is a serious affair.
And so you end up in Dignitatis Humanae with a document that clearly has little compromises built into it, but it flat out states that this document in no way changes the traditional teaching of the church on the issue of religious liberty. And by traditional teaching, they mean, well, the preference for confessional states, if that
If
ideal should present
yeah,
itself. And here's the caveat: it says, okay, confessional states are great because all states are confessional, so why not have a Catholic confessional state? But one of the elements of the confession in the confessional state has to be the guaranteeing of religious freedom.
exactly. Yeah, precisely. I mean, that's actually just the way to at least present it. I don't know if there's some who will howl, right? I mean, I'm sure there are because there are those, as you know, it's what started the SSPX, is especially that document.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Even though Lefebvre voted for it.
did he vote up on it?
Yeah, he voted yes. But then
Okay.
he later recanted. He later said,
Oh,
see, here's the deal. And Guarino points this out, right? There was pressure brought to bear on some of these bishops because many of these debates on the floor of the council went on and on and on, and they were spinning their wheels. And it's one of the reasons why the documented liturgy got published first. It's the one they spun their wheels the least on. They were working on Dei Verbum, but they just couldn't work it out completely. So they end up doing Sacrosanctum first. But anyway, uh, because of the wheel spinning that was going on, Paul VI started leaning on guys and saying, look, we know that there are still issues surrounding these documents, but we need a united front. We can't have votes going 800 to 700. We no, you know, we have to have a consensus. And so Lefebvre said that he voted for Dignitatis Humanae in order to go along with the Pope and to make sure that a consensus was reached. But then he
yeah. So
later
because I knew he did most, I just didn't. I see that one. I guess I forgot that fact. You know, it's interesting if you look at the vote counts. The one I think, if I'm correct, they got like the most negative votes is the one on social communication.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it sticks. It's not a huge number. It's 200 and some or something like that, 300 some, but it sticks out as weird. And like, I guess it's maybe because it's so unimportant. They just didn't care if there was that much dissent. Um, although I
I
know
finally
someone,
get to vote no, and it doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter. Although someone I knew, I don't know. I don't think it was David Augustine whom you've had on, but I don't know why he comes to my mind. Someone said to me jokingly, like, should teach the council, maybe Richard DeClue even, we may have been joking, teach the council as its hermeneutic is that document. Because it would be such a weird take, right? You skip that. That's the one if you're teaching the documents to the council, you just tell the students, read it, we're not going to lecture on it, you know?
Yeah. Well, speaking of hermeneutic, I mean, I just submitted, J.D. Flynn asked me to write for the Pillar, and so I submitted my first opinion essay for the Pillar today to him. We'll see whether he likes it or not. It's on the reception of Vatican II, essentially, and the proper hermeneutic for
Mhm.
approaching it. And my claim is that the council is, in fact, a ressourcement council that with strong Thomistic elements, and that therefore and that John Paul II and Benedict, and I'll get I want you to comment on this, and that John Paul and Benedict, being ressourcement theologians, give us a proper magisterial hermeneutic for interpreting the council that I fear is actually being ignored. And therefore, I think there's a great need to double down on the fact that that's what the council was. It was a ressourcement council. Now, I say that with all kinds of caveats, like, okay,
Sure, we have a
I
long enough relationship that this can be said now. I think several years ago, this would have ended in fireworks, right?
I
Maybe
think
started
so.
by me.
Yeah,
So
but
let
feel free, just let it
no,
loose,
because I'm going
man.
to music. 'Cause it's first of all, at a certain level, it has to be admitted because in the way the documents are written. I mean, consider, for instance, Dei Verbum. Um, you know, even as a Thomist, to be honest, like even as the guy who does the stuff I do for my academic stuff often, um, that old dual source approach was littered with problems because it was basically I mean, there are issues with the De Locis Theologicis of Kano, but there were also things about theological methodology that needed to be settled, and it gave a kind of first step in that direction. But if you remember, the De Locis is about theological methodology, 10 different loci that you draw from in order to
Yeah,
stabilize your conversation in theology, etc. The two sources is this, like it's something very different from that. It's basically this polemic thing that's downstream from anti-Protestant concerns that then basically creates that two channel, like the two separate sluices of data. That really does it kind of like it sets the problem in the wrong way, right? It sets the problem up wrong, so you don't understand Revelation and you can't get your right Christological grounding because you're always sort of trying to force these proposition streams back into salvation history, and it doesn't work, right? It's like, so that's my way of saying the document clearly is fixing something that's very like off in the scholasticism of the 20th century. Um, Something similar could be said, let's be honest, about Lumen Gentium. So I'm a Journée guy. I'm even roped into now doing the fourth volume on salvation history, which he's
Good.
beautiful. I didn't want to do a big volume again. They're just so big. But the young man who's going to do it got a job, and that's good for him. So I'm going to do that one. So I see, like, there's him. Of course, there's obviously Congar and others who are doing ecclesiological stuff for the council, Mersch and others. Um, but still, if you look at what scholasticism was in its De Ecclesia treatises on the whole, it was
Yeah.
effectively it was effectively the tail end of the apologetic theology. Because
Yeah.
after you did divine revelation, you did the church because you need to know who's the one true church who proposes the truths of faith. So you're basically like, if you think about like how they're teaching with Thomas's Summa, you're at the beginning of the prima pars, really far away from your Christology, even technically far away from your pneumatology and your Trinitarian theology as well, right? And so a kind of recentering of the notions of ecclesiology is something that's different than like the broad run of scholasticism. And I mean, so much so that like to this day, I know scholastics, some of whom I'm very close to and like, I consider very close friends, that still are like say there's no De Ecclesia treatise. I think how can you have no, treatment of the mystery of the church as a revealed mystery? So that indicates something. That's a leftover. That's a leftover, I think, even from that
Yeah.
era. That's my way of like recognizing it's clear, and we could do this for some other documents too.
But
It is the kind
still,
of
even if it's clear, all
well,
right,
I want to.
that, well, no, I'm
Yep.
sorry. Go ahead. I'm
No,
sorry.
because I really want to push this point because I think it's good for you and me to have this conversation because I'm curious and I think it'll work out fine. I think we're in a good place with it because I didn't just concede that by way of ad hominem, like to argue to the man, to argue to your point. Those I really think that's true. I think you cannot look at those documents and others, Orientalum Ecclesiarum, they're resource small. Um, how does one stop this from seeming like what you're claiming, and you're not, would be a kind of declaration of victory by a school at a council. Because you know what, Thomists do this, where they will basically annex the authority of Thomas or the authority of the church for themselves or for the Thomist position. And they're stealing authority, right? So this is a real thing Thomists do, right? That they will Thomisticize the deposit of faith in order to steal the church's authority for their theological school. Explain to me how you're not doing that. I know you're not. So I'm
Well,
literally saying it.
that's very interesting because in my article that I just wrote, I pointed out that the development of church doctrines in various ecumenical councils involve two things. It involves the exercise of ecclesial authority, and properly so, but it definitely also involves theological arguments.
Yeah.
And that those theological arguments do work their way into the conciliar teaching. So, even though Athanasius was not a voting member of the Council of Nicaea and hadn't written his major works yet, the fact is the Council of Nicaea has a certain, and using terms like homoousios and Trinitarian doctrine and so on, it has a certain theological framework in mind. And as such, that theological framework does, in fact, now get blessed and occupies a privileged space. And that is precisely what then gives the church's doctrines, puts fire in their equations, is there is a specific theological mind. Later on, then, once you get the medieval scholastics, you see, from medieval scholasticism on into the 20th century, you see doctrines being formulated in a Thomistic and scholastic mindset.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Those were the best theological arguments at hand. And therefore, Leo the 13th is right and other popes are right. There's a privileged space that the Thomistic synthesis occupies because the church has elevated it into her doctrinal apparatus. And I would say Vatican II is similar. Mind you, none of that precludes the fact that we're dealing with mysteries, that we're dealing not with a hegemonic statement, this is the only possible theology that one can pursue in these contexts. But nevertheless, that's the milieu. And I think that's Vatican II's milieu. This is the Council of De Lubac and Danielou, and sadly, to a certain extent, Ronner. Uh, you know, you
Sorry, that
know,
vote reflection was great.
but
Um,
it's the count, and to a certain extent, the Council of Newman.
Hmm.
Okay. And I don't think that we should be squeamish about saying, "Oh my goodness, now we've just excluded a whole bunch." No, no, because it's inclusive. This is the focus, but it's a focus that opens up into other avenues, which is why I think your research is very important, which is why we don't actually ultimately completely disagree about some important things, because I agree with you. One of the problems with the whole racehorse movement and reaction against a kind of straitjacketed scholasticism, however caricatured that is, that's how they viewed it. That threw the baby out with the bathwater in many ways. And so there is a need to retrieve the great riches of Baroque Catholicism, the great riches of the neo-scholastic synthesis of the 19th and 20th centuries, the riches of a Journet, a Shaban, these kinds of people. We need to, and that's why I'm a big fan of the project of Racehorse Thomists, scholastics, neo-scholastics, and Racehorse and guys straight up coming together to say, okay, here's the theology of the council. It was largely Racehorse. How can we supplement that? How can we build on that? How can we
Yeah, I
move
think
forward?
yeah, because I think it is just I mean, church lived for a long time. Let's just think from like I don't know, let's say Vienne through Vatican I, like just staying in council terms, that the categories are clearly marked in those doctrinal and dogmatic statements are clearly marked by scholastic vocabulary, right? When you talk about the beatific vision, the
Oh
soul as a
yeah,
form of body, the
jeez,
way
yeah.
that the
The
way that
Marian dogmas.
so even whenever you have things, yeah, Marian dogmas, yeah, exactly, obviously there, but also two things at Trent, right? I really try to emphasize, it's actually, this is Garrigou in me, to always emphasize that none of these dogmas have the same sense as the complete synthesis from which they come, such that the church doesn't consecrate a theological school. So, like when the
Right.
church talks about sacramental causality, is the example I always use. Church takes t trouble even at Trent to leave enough room that even the more occasionalist Franciscans have room to be within orthodoxy, right? But one
Yeah.
thing I probably don't think about enough is like it's still within though a certain set of bounds, right? There's a bound of scholastic idiom that's still, I mean, it's pretty strong, right? Like it's a strongly scholastic idiom. And I guess the only thing I say is when one says it's a ressourcement council, I think you can't avoid granting that. I was just trying to figure out how many knots I had. Um, you can't avoid granting that because dogmas will always be marked by the time in which they are enunciated. I just
Yeah.
always take pains to avoid. I'm doing this just as much as the Thomists, to be honest. And I guess it's like me just wanting to say I want the some similar nuance in whatever form to come from others that church still doesn't consecrate it, but she has now made part of her essential language this language, which is something then the Thomists have to take, I mean, quite seriously. And by language, I don't just mean the terms. I mean this approach to
Yes. Yes.
discursive theology. I mean, I actually think too. I mean, trying to figure out because we've got different idioms because of our trainings. I mean, you were a Balthazar guy, and I'm a guy who came through Maritain, Garrigou, Journet, etc.
Yeah.
Others. I think that there's room actually for agreement there. I used to get really on edge when I'd hear Bishop Barron say something like that. I would say this sounds like you're proclaiming the victory of like the boots on the neck of the scholastics. Submit to the canons and approach of a single school.
But I tell you what, Matthew, you have been good for me in this regard because I was, I mean, you called me out on it, and I really took a step back and said, you know what, Matthew is right. That I glibly promoted the caricature, the arid, dry, neo-scholastic manuals were just a lot of BS and rationalism, and there wasn't a whole lot there, and they controlled the Holy Office, and they were repressive, and blah blah blah. You know the whole narrative. You know the narrative better
Yeah.
than I do. And I promoted that, but I realized that that was wrong. I have issues with the theology of
Sure.
many
Yeah.
elements of that. Nevertheless, the church, to borrow a much overused and misused phrase, the church is a big tent.
Yeah, no, it is. And I'll flip that. So mine weren't public like you. I was the beginner and I was emailing. It was probably around the time, like a year before maybe I emailed you. I emailed Matt Levering once. I think I made him super nervous. I can't believe he kept talking to me. But I basically said, the day that the Communio people kneel on the front of the Basilica in DC and admit that they were nasty to the Thomists, I'll finally forgive them. And, he said, he's like, you can't go demanding this of people. He's trying to talk me down from my youthful indignation. Um, and I mean, I've changed as well in this regard. Like I used to get angry at that
Yeah.
uh, from Barron, and probably whenever you would say something. I mean, that was never quite
Oh
your
yeah.
idiom. You do say
Well,
that,
I can
but
feel for it. I mean, I get my dander up whenever people trash Balthazar with stupid caricatures about he
exactly.
believes
Oh,
everybody goes to heaven and therefore he doesn't believe in sin and blah blah blah.
exactly.
It's
It's
like,
that.
oh
It's
man.
exactly. It triggers that same response that you have there. That's what it is for me. And it's Dr. Daniel Drain.
Oh yeah, he was a
Yeah.
student of mine.
He and I, the first time we met when I was up there. Oh yeah, I forgot he was an undergrad of yours. He
Yeah.
talked to me about. I mean, even the sort of the important place Balthazar played in him personally in his life.
Yeah.
Just sort of the events of life. Um, and it hit a real chord with me. I still remember sitting where I was up at Rochester talking to him because that's what it was for Maritain for me. Like
Uh,
it just solidified a certain like an approach, right? And then it's amazing. It's kind of like talking about like going home at the beginning of the
yeah,
podcast.
that's right.
Sometimes your kind of fundamental bent in your home is then there. And I mean, the church needs to recognize this. This is not foreign to what we talked about with the Easterners, right? This is not like oh well, we're finite creatures and pluralism is the miserable condition of humanity. There's a certain kind of pluralism that is, I mean, it's de jure called for by being human. And
Yeah,
learning how to be if every piece of the body wanted to be a pancreas, it would not
that's
be good,
right.
you
That's
know.
right.
So this is my way of saying. I mean, these years of kind of the back and forth with you and I have changed my perspective on these things as well. Probably there's a certain confidence that comes with developing your own voice. I'm sure some of that's maybe less strident, but I mean, I really think I've
Yeah.
sort of because I think the same thing as you actually now about John Paul II and Benedict. There's a part of me that thinks that basically an entire generation of people who are younger need to they need to live through the implementation of the council through John Paul II's papacy, right? I
Oh,
mean,
they really do.
yeah,
I wish
that
I
they,
just I had an article in the Register, National Catholic Register, a couple weeks ago on the anniversary of John Paul's death, where I tried to get younger readers to get a feel for the fact that an older dude like me, 66 years old, who lived through the post-conciliar, what George Weigel calls the silly season, and it really was beyond silly. It was actually awful. To understand, and I was a seminarian in 1978. To gather around the TV in our seminary TV room, there was no internet,
yeah,
and because the white smoke had come out, and to see this young, dynamic, charismatic, Orthodox Polish Pope come out of the loggia of St. Peter's Basilica, I cannot tell people enough how inspiring a figure he was and how he really did, not completely, obviously, but he really did, let's put it this way, he stopped the hemorrhaging. All
yeah.
right. You talk about the church as a field hospital. John Paul was the triage guy out there staunching a bleeding artery and saying, okay, at least let's get the bleeding to stop and then let's build from here. And he
And let's be
did.
clear, he built too, though. I think that's what's important. You
Well,
see this,
yeah, but I was going to say, and it went on
that's
from
fine,
there.
exactly. Because it's you don't want to give too much rhetorical room to people say, well, fine, like right, he was what was needed during the bad season. I think that in order to understand who we are in the church, I mean, it
Yeah.
is very necessary. And this is a change in me, Larry. That wouldn't have necessarily been me. I mean, there was a bit
Yeah.
of me
Well,
very early on. I used to
good.
talk about like just set it back. You know what I mean? Just like we got to kind of but if I complain about how you can't do that because I get so mad at Thomas who only worry about Thomas's own words, right? And if I say you have to basically live through the history that has been lived through and accept it, well, then you have to live through the acceptance of the council that went on then. I mean, I don't know what to do about the last 10 years. I mean, there's something very nice about being in the East where I don't know if I made this joke on your podcast before or not, but it's a bit like, the beginning of Fiddler on the Roof. May God bless the Pope and keep him far away from us Easterners, the rabbi.
Yeah, that's
But I
right.
don't know what to do about, the status of the reception of the council now. But like that arc that was clearly evident in the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict the XVI have to be appreciated in a way that's sometimes
Yeah.
uncomfortable for Thomists who take serious like an earlier Thomism. Like you have to do a certain asceticism and not just be kind of playing for your side. I'm talking to myself. right?
What
That's
is your view? I mean, now that I've got you here, and I appreciate that. And yeah, John Paul then went on from staunching the bleeding to actually
that's it. Yeah.
a deep construct his encyclicals, his apostolic exhortations,
Yeah.
a whole body, a
I know. It's just
massive
like I just
body,
randomly read
profound
the Antinomany
teachings.
again. It's
But
like he
not
has
as long
something
as I have you
he
here,
taught me. Oh.
I mean, and you're a Thomist. What do you think of the Lublin Thomism that formed the mind of John Paul?
Yeah, and I'm not sure what to make of it because, right, when you read those early essays of his, right, you even feel that he's more thinking like an Aristotelian. What's the name of that little volume? Person in Community.
Yeah,
Uh, See, I never did a deep engagement. I mean, I am convinced that you did that an engagement with phenomenology is something that's actually very necessary. Basically because intentional existence is not taken seriously enough among scholastics. But I mean, like the being of thought, the being of the basically the being in which culture and history live. Like
yeah,
it's our particular way of being intellectual. And I mean, I think that project, at least in general, is important. I don't know what to make of the results of Lublin because some of the translational walls are, of course, high.
terrible.
Um,
The first
yeah,
translation of the acting person or the title, I mean,
exactly.
just horrible, horrible
Yeah, but
translation.
like clearly something's coming out of there. Like his theories with regard to action theory, what we would call like
Yeah.
agency, I think are just so spot on correct.
Well,
Like
that's
it's
good to hear. I'm glad to hear that because I'm not
but it's
at all.
difficult stuff because it's getting into a zeitgeist that's
Yeah,
like it's the conversation that's going on. There's an interesting mix, but I sort of lament that world's passing away. I think that the younger generation sort of
yeah,
looks askance at that project because some figures probably need to wash out among the phenomenologists, right? Whoever wants to say who's important and not. But I'm so convinced that the study of intentionality as intentionality is really important. And I'm basically echoing conversations I've had with fellow grad students who I think did.
yeah. And that's important. And it's especially important for scholars, theologians like myself, who, I mean, a lot of what we end up devoting ourselves to theologically is also the result of a certain temperament, a certain personality. And I have to admit that one of my youthful aversions to scholasticism is that I just generally have an aversion to very, very analytical, close, philosophical argumentation. I find that tedious. Like that's why I never made it all the way through any of John Paul's writings on the topic of moral agency and stuff because it's just so precise, so
Hmm.
it just my mind. I'm a big picture guy, which is why
Yeah.
I like the lyricism of a Balthazar,
Lovely.
the poetry of a Balthazar. But I think temperament plays a role in a lot of this,
I
and
think
you
it is.
need both. You need
So,
both to the precision that the scholastics bring has been lost in favor of a kind of lyrical poetry, which we needed. But now we need some of that precision back, and guys like me are not the guys to bring it back.
no, and I worry that I mean it can swing to I hope it doesn't swing too much to the precision so that we get a kind of neo-Baroquicization of things.
Yeah, you don't want
We effectively
Suarezsian.
need both. Hmm?
You don't want propositionalism and all that sort of syllogistic deductions from the first truths of dogma and all that. I mean, that's all important, but
Well, you have
that's
to have
not.
a way. You have to have a way of feeling the breath of charity in your theology. That is seeing the unity of the truths because they are truths and they are expressible, right? So they've
Yeah,
got they're quasi-propositional in some supernatural sense. But you have to have, I mean, the breath of experience. Maybe is the better way to put it.
yeah.
My boy Terrell, and he's not really my boy,
I
but you know,
yeah, that article you sent me. Oh my God, that was good.
isn't that a
You
weird?
sent
Like,
me an
it's
article,
wild
and
as you go
Dave,
through those sources. Like, as
yeah,
you
and
read
David
them, I was
Augustine sent me an article and Terrell at the same time,
Yeah, I
and I
heard because we're
read
going through
both.
this book, and we're sort of coming in two different directions. Like I'm shooting a little bit of my own camp a little bit in that article. He's, I mean, importantly noting the way that some of the dogma issues in Terrell have their echo in Ronner.
I think
Because
so.
but
But
he's in the
this
midst
the
of
re
thinking apocalyptically. He is David.
Yeah, he
So it's
is,
just a
and but
project he's working on, and that's necessary because you need to unveil what is in the zeitgeist is much like that the kind of Runnerian total lack of content for the ascent of faith. That's the problem.
oh, absolutely. You nail it. You nail it, Matthew, because here's the deal. The reason why a certain scholastic precision, even an element of propositionalism, is necessary, because if you don't have that, you end up with the Tyrrellian modernist notion that doctrines are simply the kind of epiphenomenal flotsam and jetsam of a deeper pre-linguistic, ineffable religious experience that is inarticulable, really.
Yeah, there's a this grad student who's working on some practical science in John of St. Thomas, but he said this jokingly. He says it's the kind of like, you about something else in a different figure, but it's like D-list Bergson. Like it's cheapened down, right? It's like,
I've
um,
never heard that. That's good.
yeah, well, he's young, 25, makes me feel old. Like I try to give him cultural references, but he was talking now. He was actually being unfair, unfair maybe because we were both there's something in Blondel that I was reading, and he's like, "This is D-list Hegelianism." I mean, he's very pro Hegel, but he was like, he wanted like the full Hegel. He's like,
Yeah.
Hegel already said that better. I was like,
Well, just like, not all forms of living a religiously rigorous life are Jansenist, and
Mhm.
not all accounts of the relationship between the faith and history are Hegelian. You know,
Exactly. Yeah. No,
yeah,
absolutely.
I often find people are too quick to ascribe, well, there are Hegelian influences in Ratzinger. There's Hegelian influences in Balthasar. Yeah, they're all dealing with Hegel.
Yeah,
They're,
because Hegel was Hegel in the Geist of that period before Hegel wrote. Maritain has this line in a lecture where he says it's better for Hegel to have written Hegelian ideas that people are thinking already than for them to be floating around inarticulate in the
yeah,
philosophical air and not be articulated. Because it's the encounter with the encounter with historicity in both the physical and cultural domains and the importance of it was something that had to be faced.
yeah,
Not that
absolutely.
it
And
hadn't been totally unknown, but boy, the depths of it, how deep it goes down into the fibers of like what it is to actually be a finite being, really had to be
yeah,
faced up.
speaking of getting your dander, I mean, one of the things that gets my dander up is the accusation that Balthasar is like crypto-Hegelian, when in point of fact, as Cyril O'Regan points out in the Heterodox Hegel and the Anatomy of Misremembering and so on, you know, the entirety of the Balthasarian project can be conceived as a kind of, anti-Gnostic, anti-Hegelian
Mhm.
sort of move on Balthasar. He's going to take these Hegelian categories and he's going to create an orthodox rendering of those things that, in a sense, then defangs
Hey,
defangs Hegel. It takes his
yeah.
weapons away from him.
Is that
But
what is that called? Is it heterodox Hegelian?
the heterodox Hegel, that was
Yeah,
an
that's
early
what
book.
this student's on my case. He says I got to read it. He's going to give me a copy. It's an
Oh,
extra
it's a
copy.
tome, baby. It's a tome. I mean,
Yeah.
it's up there. And then the anatomy of misremembering. I love Cyril O'Regan. I think he's just a damn genius. And
It might surprise you. I almost wrote on Hegel.
oh, you did.
Patient. I was in a Hegel class, in a phenomenology of spirit class, but I'd already written my proposal. So, you're not in a place where if your proposal's almost passed, you're not changing topics. But I came up to Anton Barbacay. He was teaching at CUA at the time, and I said, what's the German? I mean, you have a German on
Oh,
this.
did
Like,
he write A Web of Our Own Making? Anton
yeah, he did.
Barbecue? Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
he
that's
was
a
a
great
he was
book.
a very good. Yeah, I just heard about this just maybe 2 weeks ago. I didn't realize he
Yeah.
had written it. He
Yeah.
was a really good pedagogue, actually. He's one of these, like, I think it was St. John's for his undergrad, so he has that kind of close reading ability. He taught phenomenology of spirit really well. And I said, is this mitten? Is this middle in German? Whenever he keeps talking about the middle, I said, I mean, this is all syllogistic deduction. I said, is there stuff in the literature? I thought about writing a paper for the semester. He said, I don't actually know of any like significant research. I said, there's something there. I mean, he really means all of this in the logic. I mean, like figuring out like what he's doing with that it's a middle term is what it is. The middle term between certain states
Yeah. Oh,
of
yeah.
consciousness. I'm like, I can't believe no one's written a thing. He's like, do you want to write a dissertation on it? I said, I never thought I would say that I really think that's interesting, but because of how good this class is, I'd probably jump in if I don't have a meeting tomorrow to just get my boring, I want to pass dissertation approved.
Matthew, have you ever tried to read Hegel in German?
No, no, no. My German, I survived and was done. You probably
Well,
had to.
if you wrote a dissertation on Hegel, you probably would have to
Oh, it
learn
would have been a
German
number of years. It would have been a number of
because
extra years to make my German
my
better.
dissertation director, Edward Oakes, Jesuit, the
Hmm.
late great Ed Oakes, I wanted to write my dissertation simply in everything from Balthazar that had been translated into English. And he said, no, 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 no. And he started sending me huge chunks of untranslated. Well, the theologic had not been translated, and large chunks of the theodrama had not been translated, and so I had to
Oh yeah,
wade.
see, I'm thinking in terms of today. You're right. You had a lot
Oh,
that
I'm old, man. This is like the early 90s. And I mean, Fessio and Ignatius Press were just, I mean, the first volumes of the aesthetic came out in the 80s. And then slowly, slowly, everything else gets translated. But then Oak said, even the stuff in English you need to read in German. So I'm just saying this. Thank God you didn't write on Hegel because
I,
you probably would have been required to wade through his German.
yeah, I think I had something from like Schlegel that I had to translate, which is odd, but that was our selection for my test. And then I used even back 10 years ago, I mean, I used digital help whenever I had a couple dissertations on Hervaeus
Yeah.
Natalis. Luckily my literature was mostly Francophone, thank goodness. Yeah.
Yeah, but to show how much I've gone to seed, it would be very difficult for me now to read Balthazar in German.
Hmm.
I mean, I haven't. You're a translator, so you know how quickly these things
Yeah,
fade in your mind.
yeah, you have to keep. I mean, that's I always actually keep something devotional, especially given that I use nowadays so much more digital tools, like to
You
keep
know how
my
I
chalk.
learned German? I read two guys, Guardini and Pieper. That's how I
I
learned
was thinking
German.
deeper. When I was studying for my test, I would because I usually would for my tests, I would pray the breviary in whatever language I like for my grad school test for
Yeah.
language. But the Germans have some kind of copyright on that, so you can't get it on iBreviary. They're like
Well,
trying
just
to
the
they can't squeeze money out of enough sources, you know? But Peeper I would read because
oh
there
yeah,
was a sort of
very
lucidity.
clear. And
Yeah.
a word of advice to all young grad students out there who are trying to master a foreign language. A great way to learn a language is to read that language in the Bible, to read
Uh-huh.
the French
Yes.
Bible, to read the German Bible, because for more than likely you know most of the passages
Yep. You
already.
know the
So
story. That's
you can,
yep.
as you're reading along, you can back engineer. Oh, that's what that verb is, and oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's what that meant.
That's a
Anyway,
very
we're
uh,
like all over the
yeah.
place now.
No,
So
but
we
that's
got
that's good advice. That's still good advice though. And read it
yeah.
out loud. Get it in your
Or
ear. Tim
I
Noon used
learned
to always get
Spanish.
it in.
I lived in the Dominican Republic for a while, and I learned Spanish down there. And I learned that one of the best ways to learn Spanish, anyway, was to watch children's cartoons in Spanish because the language is so simple. All
Yeah.
right, it's a very simple. You learn very very basic vocabulary and verbs watching children's cartoons.
Yeah.
And that was so I ended up with the Spanish of Daffy Duck.
Well, my kids sometimes watch Peppa Pig in French, so there you have it.
Anyway, thank you
Well,
for being on the show today, Matthew. Any last words to the audience?
no, just have a good. I mean, I presume it'll go up pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, I'll probably put it up tomorrow.
So have a blessed, to you and to
That's
viewers.
right.
Blessed week.
Holy Week's coming up. Palm Sunday on Sunday. So yeah, blessed Holy Week to everyone listening. So thanks again, man. This is a great conversation. I had so much fun.
This is great. It's
All
like
right.
time flies. All right.
God, yeah. Anyway. All right. Thanks everyone, and thank you, Dr. Minard. Bye now.